Hello everyone and welcome back to Always Watching. Today we're discussing My Brilliant Friend Season 4 Episode 2, and this was one of my favorite episodes this whole series. It was heartbreaking. It was just I went through a roller coaster of emotions watching this. Elena, this episode was akin to a drug addict, constantly on the phone trying to get Nino to submit. I didn't mention this in the last episode, but I do like how her outfits mirror her internal stage. Like, she just looks like a disheveled mess. I love how most of the episode took place in Franco's home, because she's basically in this self-imposed prison until Nino comes back. I also love the contrast between Franco's home and the grandparents' home. Franco's home is very free-spirited, where anything goes. Like, it's the definition of a safe space. It was also a grim reminder that you can be surrounded by people who love you and still be incredibly lonely. Franco's death, even in the books, was incredibly tragic, and I actually thought that he was the best part of this entire episode. The episode begins and ends in Naples, with Elena leaving Nino and then subsequently returning to him. I love how the episode ends with a sunrise and a nightmare. They wake up together to start this beautiful life, but it's not a life she asked for, it's one that she's settling for. As soon as she gets back with Nino, all her nightmares, all her anxieties come rushing back to her. And the differences between Nino and Elena this episode was just night and day. Throughout the episode, Elena just keeps calling him and calling him. And I like how they depicted the passage of time, because Elena's life is completely paralyzed. She's airing out her dirty laundry to everyone around her. Like, there's complete transparency with what's going on with Elena. Meanwhile, Nino is calling from a payphone, or he's always alone when he's talking to Elena. And this is because his life doesn't stop. His life keeps going, and hers is just frozen in time. The start of the episode, even in the books, I really thought that she would leave Nino, because at this point she sees the truth. And Nino, God bless him, instead of apologizing, he tries desperately to justify his behavior. He has one of the best lines this episode: "I don't want you to excuse me, I just want you to understand me." He's also a bit of a drug addict. He can't really stop living these double lives. He's basically saying to her, listen, if you'll agree to this fiction, we can live happily ever after. And he tries everything to convince her. He tries to seduce her. He tries to offer her the world. And the difference between Nino and Elena is Nino will never sacrifice himself for someone else. Like, the thought of that simply pains him. Despite Elena's persistence, Nino's stance never changes. And because of this, she's just stuck in limbo. Rather than just cut him off, or at least try to move to Naples with her daughters, she locks herself away in Franco's home. I think she believes that she's actually hurting him by doing so, when in fact it's having no effect on his life. Throughout the episode, she refuses to take any calls outside of Nino. She hangs up on Lila, and Franco and Meriosa, there's really nothing they can do. They're just kind of on the sidelines watching this, because they're like, well, if we say anything, she's not going to listen to us anyways. Before going to Franco's house, she manages to retrieve her daughters from Adele. And I love the way this conversation between Adele and Elena was shot side by side. Elena basically airs out Adele's dirty laundry out in the open. And I will say, Adele is also a terrible human being. She hides behind etiquette to justify really terrible behavior. And she's just like Nino. She lives these double lives. They don't feel like they need to sacrifice their own needs for the people around them. And so for that, they actually all have a lot in common. However, I will say Adele's characterization of Elena was on point, because I think a part of the reason Elena is attracted to Nino is because he's a star, and she thinks that by being in his proximity, some of this will rub off. But everything she perceives about him to be true, like his talent, is just a farce. When she does regain custody of her daughters, she doesn't actually know what to do with them, and they keep asking her, where are we going, where are we going, where are we going? And eventually she settles to Franco's home, but she actually doesn't know what to do. And this uncertainty is quite terrifying. Franco's home becomes a kind of like purgatory. When they get to Franco's house, the vibes are off. Like, she doesn't know what else to do. Franco's home is an open door. Like, it's very free-spirited. It feels like a very open and honest space. And when she arrives, she's greeted by a very hostile Meriosa, and honestly, rightfully so. Meriosa basically is fed up. She's done being her sister. She doesn't like the way that she's disrespected her mother or her brother. And the only reason that she is tolerating Elena is because of Franco. But she is at her wit's end with this woman. Whether or not Elena wants to admit to it, the level of disrespect that she has shown to this family, Pietro in particular, is just totally out of line. They have every right to say whatever they want to her. Elena's decision to move in with Franco is really a desperate one because she can't move to Naples without Nino. And as a result, she's basically holds her children and everyone in this house hostage. I love how these phone calls were shot. Again, time is going by and nothing is changing. Nino's life is resuming as normal. And Elena is going through the motions, but she's incredibly exhausted. She's not really working on her writing at all because all she can think about is Nino. Watching her beg this man over the phone was one of the most depressing things I have ever seen. And it was just pathetic to watch. Like, the longer Nino takes to make a decision, the more irritable she becomes, the more unbearable she becomes. God bless Franco and Mariosa. They're trying their best, hoping that she will come to her senses or make a decision. They're taking care of her children, they're tutoring her, and they're all just kind of waiting to see what she's going to do next. I do think the interaction between Elena and her daughters was fascinating this episode because they're not even asking her anymore, where are we going next? They're not really probing her, they're not pushing her, they're not saying anything insulting. Day Day in particular is looking at her mom, and you get the sense that they feel really bad for her, like they feel really sorry for her, and they don't really want to do anything to make the situation worse. And so they're just kind of hoping that she'll put two and two together and eventually she'll make a decision. And during this time, the girls are exposed to all kinds of lifestyles and they're privy to all kinds of conversations that they obviously were not privy to in Adele's home. One of my favorite scenes this episode is when Mariosa is hosting one of Elena's talks and they're discussing the female body and female autonomy with mothers in particular, and how a lot of times mothers are not seen as like real women. Like, once you become a mother, your body is no longer your own, and any attempts to make it your own is riddled with guilt and shame. There's nothing wrong with Elena or any woman wanting to explore their bodies or define their autonomy for themselves. Like, women's bodies are made for more than just producing children. And again, there is honor in wanting to explore your own pleasure outside of traditional norms. But in the context of this relationship with Nino, like, that ain't it. Her desire for Nino, like, she even admits that it's an obsession. Like, the whole thing is totally irrational. And this is not an example of female autonomy. Like, she's completely succumbed to this man's desires. Like, she's made herself a tool for him to be used any way he wants. At the end of this episode, she actually calls herself a fraud. Although she's incredibly educated and well-rounded, she really displays no more power over her body than women who did not have her privileges. And I think the more we watch Elena, especially when we compare her to someone like Lila, through Elena's eyes, Lila is the opposite. She's someone that does have some autonomy over her body, or at least tries to have autonomy over her body, particularly who has access to it. Like, Lila does not allow herself to be a tool for others. And this whole idea that the more educated a woman is, the more autonomous she is, has always been very strange to me. Like, the idea that just because you're educated, you're less susceptible to the male gaze has always been a weird lie. Like, some of the most subservient women I know are like Elena. They are the most educated on paper. And while Nino is thriving and living his best life and clocking into his new cushy job, Elena is just stuck in this apartment, and her self-imposed prison comes to an end when Pietro comes to visit. And God bless Pietro, like, his reaction when he came over was complete shock. The girls are not going to school and there's no plan. Like, what's disturbing Pietro is the uncertainty. Like, when is she going to make a decision? And also, what happens if Nino doesn't come back? I love the contrast between Pietro and Franco. Both are very good men. However, the difference is Franco is a lot more sensitive to Elena's needs and he's a lot more patient. Whereas Pietro is trying, but he really doesn't know what to do. Like, he's trying to give her the space she needs to sort herself out. But at the same time, he's not sure he's making the right decision. I think with Pietro, why I love his character so much is because he's a product of his environment. He grew up with parents who lied to each other constantly. And as far as he's concerned, he did whatever he had to do to be a good husband. He provided for his wife financially, but there was a lot about her needs mentally and emotionally that even though he was able to recognize, he just didn't really know what to do about it. And you can tell that he's trying to change his behavior, but he's just as lost as everyone in this house. And again, Pietro is a true gentleman, and you can tell that Franco and Miriosa feel very bad for him. They really sympathize with him, but they're also between a rock and a hard place. And watching Elena, it's very easy for us to sit here and say, well, that would never be me. I would never be this down bad for a man. But the way that never comes boomeranging back, we all know how karma works. And as sad as it is to watch her, I'm sure, like, you guys let me know in the comment section below. We all know people like this who have been this down bad, or maybe you are one of them. But it's really a scary thing to watch. As soon as Pietro leaves, Elena is able to finally leave this bubble that she's been in. She takes her daughters to school, and it seems for a while withdrawal from Nino is helping. Like, she's coming off the drug. That is until Nino's raggedy behind shows up unannounced. And what's fascinating about Nino is that he shows up not to apologize, but to really double down. And listening to him was such nonsense. I mean, he is basically arguing that, listen, I can love you just as much as I love my wife. Like, y'all can be parallels. Yes, you are equal. And he goes on to say that actually, unless I maintain this lie, we can't be together. Like, the lie is necessary for me to be with you. And when all else fails, he basically just nukes her by telling her that his wife is pregnant, 7 months pregnant. And her reaction was completely perfect because he goes completely blurry. And this blurry vision is something that comes up a lot in the series because this is not a man that she knows. Like, he just dropped a bomb on her and she immediately seeks refuge to the only man that she does know, which is Franco. And I love the way that the scene was shot with Franco trying to comfort her and Raggedy Nino alone in the room. And the way that Elena brought her chaos into his space, I don't think she considered the effect that this would have on him. Like, the only person she's seeing is herself. She's not really seeing how this drama is affecting everyone around her. And Nino, he leaves and he makes it very clear. It's my way or the highway. And Elena, just when I feel like she was maybe making the right decision, maybe she was starting to wean off it, she decides to go back to him. But before she goes back to him, she has one last conversation with Franco. And this was my favorite scene in this whole episode. And Franco steps in. For the most part, everyone has tried to keep out of it. But after that argument, he's like, girl, you brought me into this, so I'm going to tell you how it is. And he basically says, listen, if you love this man more than you love yourself, then you have to take him as he is and every other disgusting thing that he's capable of. I find it interesting that she wants to move back to Naples with Nino. Like, she has this impression of Nino in her head from when she was a child, and that impression has never grown. Like, her opinion of Nino has never changed. Like, it stayed the same as she's gotten older. And Franco summarizes Nino and Elena's relationship in basically one line. He says, in love, it's only over when you become yourself again without fear or disgust. Her holdout with Nino, like her desperation for him to save her and take her out of this apartment and take her to Naples, is really strange because without Nino, she feels like she's incapable of doing anything. And you see this episode, she doesn't work on anything. She's not really living autonomously. She's dependent on everyone around her to take care of her. Like, she's not really standing on her own 2 feet. At the end of the episode, when she is with him, she's still paranoid. She's still having nightmares about not being with him. The episode ends with Elena in Naples. And you could tell her daughters are not really used to this type of crowd. Like, they're quite in shock. And I think the last few lines this episode really give us insight into why Elena is moving the way that she's moving. Throughout her whole life, she's tried to rise above her circumstances, and the further that she was able to get away from the neighborhood, the more successful that people perceived her to be. The more she tries to distance herself from the neighborhood, the worse off she seems to feel. And there's so much that she's left behind that she really needs to deal with and confront. And I feel like Nino was an avenue for that. Like, she has this imposter syndrome, and maybe she feels like coming back to the neighborhood will finally end this feeling that she's had her whole life. So we'll see. You guys let me know what you think, and until next time.